Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our first session of day two of our Global Sustainable Business Summit. This morning, we will be talking about the EU Green Deal. As the US gears up for a whole new approach to climate under the Biden administration, Europe has been preparing its own huge response to the climate crisis for months now. With me to discuss where we are with the EU Green Deal, we have two great experts in the field who I'm delighted to welcome. We have Cameron Hepburn, Professor of Environmental Economics and Director of the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at the University of Oxford. And we have Claire O'Neill, a former UK Climate Change Minister and now Managing Director for Climate and Energy at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Welcome. Thank you for joining me. Claire, let me start with you. As someone who's been very close to the policy making machinery on climate in Europe, can you just give the audience who perhaps are maybe not familiar with the ins and outs of EU policy a quick overview of where we are now in terms of what the EU Green Deal actually is and where we are in the process of approving it and getting it actually into action?
Well, I mean, for once, the world's largest trading bloc has put its money where its mouth is. And so I think a couple of things to highlight on this deal. You know, the amount of money that is being talked about as a commitment is huge. It's trillions of euros. And very sensibly, what the Commission is talking about is both the overall amount of this as a percentage of GDP, it's very small, but also the cost of climate inaction, the fact that the spending on these climate positive policies would be outstripped by the cost of flood defences if we did nothing. So it's a very interesting rhetoric. The flagship of the Green New Deal is a climate law that is essentially set in place to continue to reduce the EU's emissions. They're down about 25–30% so far since 1990. They want to go to minus 55% by 2030. But supporting this flagship law is a massive flurry of really interesting initiatives, initiatives on methane, proposals potentially for a carbon border tax adjustment, conversations about governance in companies. So it's actually an incredibly holistic approach, not just to build back better and build back greener, but to really move the constituent parts of this EU single market forward cohesively. And in terms of timing, this is all being worked up for presentation for legislative approval in June next year. We know what the statements are going to be. There's going to be pushback from some of the coal-intensive economies of the EU, but already intensive diplomatic efforts to work out what a good transition looks like for them. And worth noting that Angela Merkel was extremely influential in getting Germany to commit to come off coal, something that had been a real problem for the German emissions when they gave up on their nuclear commitment. And she knows how to build consensus and deliver that sense of a just transition for the coal mining parts of Germany. And I know she's very actively involved in doing that across the EU as well.
And can you give us a sense, I mean, if you looking at the press at the moment, there's this big dispute going on between the centre, the core of the EU and Poland and Hungary. Could you perhaps handicap for us just a little bit the chances of this all going through? As we all know, rhetoric is great, but real change has to go through the machinery of the policy-making process and through parliaments. How optimistic or pessimistic are you about all of this getting through?
I'm going to give it a plus 75% chance, because I think what is being presented here is the anchoring of this transition in the sense of jobs generative, developments. This is not about putting money on people's energy bills. It's not about, effort shares, all the usual stuff that I used to have to do when I went to Europe. These they felt quite sort of micro levels of negotiations. This is a really big, bold package that is going to basically fund this. I mean, the funding commitments are 82 to 150 billion euros a year, but essentially, as I said, putting that in the context of the cost of inaction. So there will be funding around to help these coal-dependent parts of the EU move forward rapidly, and and I'd expect those countries to be lobbying for that. But interestingly, in some of the communiques that have come out over the last 6 months, there appears to be an appetite for that not complete fracture, but for that divergence of opinion. You get the sense that the commissioner with Mrs. Merkel and also with President Macron, who of course have been incredibly powerful as a triumvirate in working with China, in particular the Chinese proposal to go carbon neutral, whatever that might be, by 2060, is almost entirely due to EU diplomacy. So they are, I feel that they've got the bit between their teeth. They're going to put money behind this, and they're looking at it as a very holistic package. So I'm an optimist about this going through. And of course, I love the UK's 10-point plan, but the scale of this and the funding of this is a step change in terms of ambition.
Yes, I want to get maybe at the end, if we have time, we can get back to the UK plan and talk a little bit about the compare and contrast them a little bit. But Cameron, I'd like to turn to you now. The focus of one of the focuses of this panel is, of course, on the recovery and how much can green stimulus spark a green recovery in Europe. How optimistic are you about that, and which are the parts of the Green Deal from an economic perspective, from an economy boosting perspective, are you most excited about?
Yeah, well, I'm pretty optimistic too. I mean, I think, as Claire says, we've been reviewing 2,300 different stimulus policies from all around the world, and if you look at the EU policies, they are putting money where their mouths are on this. So things are lining up quite nicely. So it's not just the kind of big net zero commitments to many hundreds of gigawatts of electrolyzers and hydrogen and renewable energy. It's also, John, as you say, that the sensible actions taken today to help recover our economies from the pandemic. And you look across the world, you can see some leadership in South Korea. We've got leadership on paper from China and the US, and we'll see what comes of that in the short term. But it's the EU who's really making the running here, and it's frankly, it's very exciting to watch. It's not a moment too soon, I might add, in the scale of the challenge that we have in front of us.
And can you talk to us a little bit? You just mentioned hydrogen there. Hydrogen does seem to be going through something of a renaissance at the moment. There's a lot of excitement around it. You read lots of policy papers. It's every company right now seems to be falling over themselves to announce some sort of hydrogen plan. Can you talk to us a little bit about how much of that is hype, perhaps, but how much of it is real as well? How important, how seriously should we take all this talk about hydrogen that we're hearing right now?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, as is often the way. But it's serious. It's serious in a way that it wasn't. The last time we had a big hydrogen hype, and the reasons that it's serious this time are twofold. I mean, I think the first one is that the economics now is looking different and promises to get better and better for green hydrogen. And the reason the economics is so much better isn't just that the cost of the kit, the electrolyzers that you use to produce the hydrogen, is coming down. It's the cost of the renewable energy going in to those devices that has been crashing, as we all know. So the economics makes it a much easier sell. It's not to say it's not, it's got some way to go before you would expect massive scale and a kind of complete takeover of the molecular components of the energy system. But it seems obvious that that's kind of where we're headed. And then the other reason that it's real this time is because as you start to vision what a net zero economy looks like, and as we have these net zero commitments, now almost 3/4 of the world's GDP is under a net zero commitment. The question arises, well, how do you reach the parts of the economy that the electricity grid is not going to get to? And you've got to have a molecule. And whether that molecule is ammonia or whether it's some liquid organic compound, hydrogen is the platform building block for that molecular part of the energy system. And we're going to have to clean up, the fertilizer industry and the production of urea, which takes green ammonia, which will require green hydrogen. And we need to do steel and so on and so forth. So hydrogen's got, it's not necessarily going to be in every passenger vehicle. I think that's where there's a lot of hype, or at least misunderstanding of its role. But it's going to play a very, very important role in the energy system of the coming decades.
Claire, do you want to get in on that? I mean, before this panel, we were talking a little bit about the grid. And of course, in the US, we've heard a lot from Biden's team about wanting to create a clean net zero grid, I think by 2030. How important is hydrogen for you in terms of the EU's grid and what that looks like in 10 years' time?
Well, I think Cameron's set out, where we are, which is we've got a massive hype. It's a bit like the conversation about renewables 15 years ago. And by the way, there's an opportunity to make lots of really expensive mistakes with the policy that, as we did with renewables. The key thing about hydrogen is that it is possible, particularly in gas-dependent economies, to do a lot of substitution. And actually, if you can scale up this green hydrogen production or scale up carbon capture and storage, you can then use gas as a provision of that fuel. And as Cameron rightly says, so much of the energy system is molecular in terms of delivery. And also, we don't have a plan for the hard to abate sectors. We always talk about how we should stop flying and we should, have lots of protests. I used to say to the Extinction Rebellion, well, you should go and protest outside Scunthorpe, because actually we don't have a plan for steel, and that's what we need to deliver to actually decarbonise these hard to abate sectors. But hydrogen is different, and it requires a lot of infrastructure investment. And the point I sort of have made again, and I see more evidence of this again in the EU plan, is a willingness to grip these very boring questions about pipes and offtake and input points and shipping terminals and storage facilities, and the stuff that never rewards governments at the ballot box, requires an awful lot of public-private interaction, but actually is fundamental to this decarbonisation journey. I mean, in the UK, for example, we used to burn town gas. 40% of that was essentially hydrogen. We're now down to about 2% of North Sea gas. We don't have the pipes for much of the grid to introduce that level of hydrogen back into the grid. We have some of it, it would be great. Italy is the same. So I think there is huge opportunity, but I think we have to, in order to really make this work, we've got to rapidly drop the cost, which isn't a technology game, but also invest in these infrastructure points. And the best way, the people who are really advancing this actually are those clusters, those industrial clusters, places like the Port of Rotterdam, the Teesside industrial cluster, because it's quite an intricate thing to join up the supply and demand and new uses of hydrogen. And to Cameron's point, there's a lot of hype about hydrogen fuel cells in vehicles. I mean, I've never quite understood that, but equally you need those refueling points if you're going to do that. So really trying to create that hydrogen infrastructure at a local level, as well as the big picture thinking, is what's required. And again, the EU is starting to think about this, which is great to see.
And for the uninitiated, how much money are we talking here? I mean, is there, in terms of, all of these new technologies require a certain amount of government help before they sort of reach the economies of scale, reach escape velocity. Are we going to need a lot of taxpayers' money to get this hydrogen revolution, even if it is just focus on the grids, to get that up and running?
I'd love to take that one. I mean,
you take it, and no, please, Karen.
Okay, so in the short run, we've seen tens of billions being allocated across France and Germany in particular. The UK is making allocation as well, and that's just the beginnings of what is going to be what needs to be a major global industry. But by the time you get to a net zero economy, you're talking about more like hundreds of gigawatts of capacity, electrolysis capacity, or blue hydrogen capacity, and then as Claire says, you're into the hundreds of billions and the trillions. And then, John, to your point, where's the money coming from? I mean, there's what we're doing here is really being the Victorians of the 21st century and building out, as Claire says, a set of infrastructures that once they're in place, they'll be there for generations henceforth. They'll be there for the next century, and they're very low marginal cost. So yes, there is a chunk of work to do, but remember that creates jobs, it creates investment returns. And then once you're at this point where renewable energy is so cheap, your cost of electrolysis or your hydrogen production is so cheap, then you're winning in the energy system on its own terms. You're not paying, you're net benefiting. So I think that's the story here. Some significant upfront investment to make the world a much better place thereafter. Sorry, Claire.
Yeah, and just to amplify Cameron's very good point. So I think that the scale up is the challenge. So green hydrogen is, at 5 $5 a kilo and upwards now. It needs to be sub 2 to be in any way competitive as a molecular source of high heat. That's a scale game in terms of can you electrolyze enough. But we have nowhere near the land mass to put out the level of onshore renewables to deliver that. So we're going to have to, again, get clever about how we use offshore or offshore wind, my favorite technology, or indeed use a blended mix using gas. And again, so all of those who are holding this out as the wonder molecule, some of these tough questions aren't being answered. But to Cameron's point, it's a great analogy about the Victorians. In the UK, government had almost no role in building out the Victorian infrastructure for railways, for sewers, for the transmission system. It was done largely with private capital and then upgraded investments, period in state ownership and then private again. For me, one of the challenges is we always define success as how much governments are going to spend. And I think that keeps technologies out of the money for longer, because essentially it just creates a subsidy that's in the system that lazy people take. And so this constant focus on what's good business, how do we actually get at real IRRs that stand alone? Because we know, one of the other things we know is there is a wall of capital that wants to play now in this green space. So how do we work to make these projects bankable? And again, I've been very struck with it's often a micro approach that is making those projects bankable rather than these very big macro approaches that we just assume are going to require trillions of dollars of taxpayers' money. It's not the right approach, because ultimately, governments are not terribly innovative in this space. You want companies and local communities to be pulling this through. And again, if I could deliver, one message to the Biden administration, I mean, John Kerry is a great ambassador, is just don't repeat the mistakes. Don't put solar panels on British roofs at a cost of £24 billion over the lifetime of the project that put up poor people's energy bills and gave rich people a return on their pension investments. That was just a bad policy. I'm sorry. And that when we tend to default to making these policy choices in the name of doing the right thing, rather than thinking about what's cost effective, what's bankable, and how can we do things most rapidly.
Well, hopefully John Kerry is watching this and taking on your advice. Yeah. Can I ask you just to talk very briefly, again, this is about the green recovery, and we touched on it earlier. One of the best ways to sell this to politicians and governments is to talk about it in terms of jobs. And of course, this is something that Biden talked about in his campaign as well, that green job, the green revolution will create very many jobs. When you look at the EU deal, which parts of it, have the potential to be the biggest sources of employment? Cameron, perhaps you want to go first, and then Claire.
What we know about green jobs is that your jobs per unit of energy are much higher in the green sector than in the fossil sector for understood reasons. And we also know that when you're in a recession, as Keynes from Cambridge, dare I say, pointed out, you can be better off digging holes and filling them in again. And really what we have been saying, and many others similarly, if you're going to dig a hole, you might as well plant a tree in it before you fill it in again. And so the jobs intensive areas are quite significant. So there's an awful lot of jobs in natural capital restoration. There's a lot of jobs in creating the charging points, in rethinking about urban mobility, how you design your cities, redesign your cities, as well as the jobs that we know are there in installing the offshore wind farms and the odd solar panel too, Claire, perhaps not quite in the UK, but wherever they should go. So this is, as looked at in aggregate, this is just a very sensible thing to be doing at this particular point in time. And it's great that the EU is doing it. I would say that it's a shame in a way that you've got some other countries, not to name too many names, but if I'm looking at the policies coming out of Mexico at the moment, or South Africa, there's quite a few missed opportunities there. So it's good to be focusing on the trading bloc that's getting it right.
And just to amplify that again, I mean, I think this point about the job substitution, it's very difficult if you go to India and look at how hard it is for India to come off coal. There are a lot of jobs, politically important jobs in fossil fuel extraction. The estimates of those jobs in a solar, a much improved solar grid, both in terms of grid construction and maintenance, are tenfold. And in actually many cases, it's the same people or the same skills that drive the transition. So the transfer of skills that have built up in the North Sea basin around offshore oil and gas extraction are incredibly transferable to offshore wind development and maintenance. And I have to say, one of the most uplifting things I did as minister launching the offshore wind sector deal was to go to places like Grimsby, Great Yarmouth, Lowestoft, which now have shipbuilding industries building the support vessels for offshore wind. They've got massive data management centres, really high-skilled jobs. It's a renaissance starting to happen based on a new renewable industry. It has really transformative power. And again, and the other thing, just frankly to say, is it's a bit like sitting before the internet was created. I'm old enough to remember pre-internet days, and saying, what jobs will the internet create? Well, there'll be lots of jobs in telecoms and data centers. We genuinely have no idea. The opportunity for data management, for connectivity, for improved, remote sensing, again, an area for the scientists. There are huge opportunities out there. And I think we don't talk enough about that. Where are the big return opportunities going forward? There where a bit of government subsidy, but a lot of private sector innovation and risk capital can really advance the agenda.
Yeah, and just to Cameron's point as well, I imagine, just look at the jobs that the Victorian Railways created as well. Same argument. I'd like to turn briefly just to the international environment. Cameron, perhaps you want to start on this, and then Claire, we can talk a little bit about COP perhaps as well. So in addition to the EU Green Deal, we have, of course, Biden coming into the White House, and we have China promising a net zero by 2060. The climate, the global sort of push on climate has been with us now for decades. There's been many fault stones before. But just how big a moment is this right now in the global climate policy push?
It feels pretty big to me, I have to say. We've never been in this situation where so many countries have stepped up, and the big ones in particular. The Chinese net zero target, my cynical colleagues would say, well, they have to do it anyway. They'll be underwater if they don't. They're just signing up to something that would want to do anyway. And so what? I mean, yes, it is wonderful that this is in countries' enlightened self-interest to realize that actually they need to be pushing for net zero at home, and actually everybody needs to be pushing everybody else to do this as well for our, it's good economics actually. So I feel like we're in a place that we haven't been before in the climate discussions and negotiations. It's as positive as I can remember it, where I feel like we're at a bunch of tipping points now. The economics in many of the relevant technologies is very different to how it was at Kyoto or Paris or Copenhagen, even Paris. It's 5 years ago. A lot has changed in 5 years. And the politics has moved fast too. Public opinion has moved. There's all sorts of things that are starting to come together. And as I said at the start, it's not a moment too soon, because for me, the question isn't whether we will do this, because we will. I mean, we're not so stupid as to not to. It's will we do it fast enough?
Yeah.
And Claire, this brings me to you. I mean, all of this will come together at COP26.
Yeah.
What should we be looking at? I mean, COP, of course, is a pretty impenetrable outfit. The policy process there is impenetrable, and it's very hard to explain to lay people, as you well know. What should we be looking for over the next year? What are the key sort of tension points and conflict points and main issues of debate that our viewers should be looking out for over the next 12 months or so?
So COP is impenetrable. I mean, COP is simply a negotiation for a communique. It's classic UN territory. And I've just given evidence to the Select Committee in the UK on some of the frustrations around that process. But it is a tentpole moment, big tent moment that is not to be wasted. This is the moment where, as Cameron said, you have this sense of pressure. encouragement, financing flows to get countries to commit. The Japanese commitment, I think, is incredibly important, even more important in some ways than the Chinese commitment, because that will be delivered largely by private sector organizations. And which brings me to this other point. This is the moment where everybody needs to be in. This is not just about government to government. It's about the private sector, the financial sector, the cities and the states. And even though those organizations don't have a natural landing zone in COP, they sort of sit off in this amorphous, real world action space, which is a little bit strange. I think the ability to really make commitments and to show the governance, transparency and investment that support them is absolutely there. And ultimately, the COP for me should be that big tent that brings together both the governmental action and results, but also the huge commitments the private sector and the financial sector are now making. And hopefully this will be a chance to blend it in Glasgow later next year.
And so what does success look like in concrete terms?
Success looks like closing the Paris rulebook, which is a deeply boring but exceptionally necessary set of agreements so that countries can keep each other honest. Success looks like having lots of heads of state there, having sufficient pressure to put this at the top of politicians' in trays. Typically, politicians don't really engage with COP. The last big moment was Paris, and as Cameron says, the new Biden administration and the success in the EU and the Chinese sort of announcements, I think, will bring together a wall of interest amongst global leaders, which will be helpful. Success looks like agreeing some more financial flows. It's very important to develop the developing South that the big countries continue to pay. And I'm on the record as saying, and I'll say it again, I think it's a real shame the UK is backing off its international aid commitments, because part of that was increasingly focused on supporting climate action and adaptation. But for me, over and above that, what will be hugely important is the level of commitment and action and promises and action from the global private sector. Coming together, net zero sector deals, for example, coming out of autos, some of the hard to abate sectors. The sense, I think, that everybody is in the tent and doing their bit, and that, and what are we actually aiming for? We're aiming to inflect the Keeling curve. We talk all this stuff about Paris alignment and 1.5 degrees. We just need to see CO2 levels starting to slow their rate of increase and come down. And so far, despite COVID, if you look at the Mauna Loa, the Keeling curve reporting information, COVID is a blip in a long-term trend. And you know what? We can only empty the planes once. So we're going to have to do something very different in order to get control of this trajectory.